Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is fraught with tension. The United States is flexing its muscles on two fronts in the days following President Trump's airstrikes in Syria. A coordinated diplomatic campaign towards Russia is underway by the U.S. and the U.K. British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson has canceled his visit to Moscow to, quote, coordinate international support for a ceasefire at the G7 meeting on Monday. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, however, will go on the trip amidst renewed tensions between Washington and the Kremlin. Meanwhile, a show of American military might in the Pacific as a Navy strike group moves towards North Korea. Defense officials say the aircraft carrier is being sent in response to recent provocations by the Hermit Kingdom. This all happens amidst a violent weekend across the globe. Two churches bombed in Egypt on this Palm Sunday, killing dozens and injuring hundreds more. Swedish police have just arrested a second suspect in the truck attack in Stockholm this week that killed 4 people. An Uzbek man was already in custody. Violent clashes in Venezuela, meanwhile, as thousands fill the streets there to protest their socialist government. And, of course, continued violence in Syria, including renewed bombing by the Assad regime and coalition forces. It's a very busy morning around the world. Let's welcome the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Hey, Ambassador Haley, thanks so much for joining us. You said on Friday that the United States is, quote, prepared to do more in Syria, but I want to understand what the threshold might be for additional military action. Would it be the use of chemical weapons, or could even a conventional attack on civilians be the trigger?
Well, Jake, what I can tell you is what happened this week was really one of the president's finest hours. To sit and watch all of the conversations and how he listened to each and every member of his Security Council and asked all the right questions. He wanted to know exactly what the facts and the evidence was. He wanted to know what the options were, what the risks were, and the political strategy and solution side of it. And after all of that, he made a very, strong decision. And I think it was one that was very good for the world. What I can tell you now is this is how he responded to the chemical attack in Syria. I was trying to give warning and notice to the members of the Security Council and the international community that he won't stop here. If he needs to do more, he will do more. So really now what happens depends on how everyone responds to what happened in Syria, and make sure that we start moving towards a political solution and we start finding peace in that area. And so I think a lot of people need to step up. The United States is going to continue to watch and be active, and we'll see what happens.
So further military action is possible, but I guess what I'm wondering is the chemical weapons attacks have been going on since 2013, but far more Syrians have been killed by conventional weapons, barrel bombs and the like. Might that also be a trigger? I mean, President Trump clearly said that the use of chemical weapons is what crossed the line for him, but is that the only line?
Well, I can tell you that his focus was on the fact that innocent victims were hurt by a terrible regime that was attempted to be covered up by Russia, or, make excuses for Assad by Russia. And he said he wasn't going to put up with it. And to see the images, to see the pictures, and to see the horror of that act, knowing that it was a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, knowing it was a violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, he said enough. We're not going to watch this anymore.
So, but this is a departure, and while I'm not second-guessing the decision, as I said, it's not the first chemical weapons attack. It's not the worst chemical weapons attack. And in fact, during the campaign, President Trump warned against getting involved militarily in Syria. Take a listen.
Not that big an area. The airspace is very limited. So now you have, what are we going to start, World War III over Syria?
So he was worried about starting World War III over Syria. Why is that no longer a concern, and why was the 2013 chemical weapons attack, which, as you know, was deadlier, not a trigger for him in terms of the principle of an action in Syria?
Well, he wasn't president in 2013. And
but he opposed it. He opposed action, though.
But I don't know what his thought process was then. I can tell you what his thought process was this week, which was he is not going to condone chemical weapons use ever. And so what you saw was he wasn't just going to say it, he was going to act. And what we have seen at the United Nations is a huge sigh of relief. They're just so thankful that the United States led on this issue. And we called out Russia because we needed to. We've put Iran on notice because we need to get that influence out of there, and we've told Syria we are not going to watch this anymore. And so what the president chooses to do, I hope that what Iran sees and Syria sees and Russia sees is that this is a president that's not afraid to act, and that he does expect to move towards a political solution, and they have to show genuine willingness to do that.
He's not concerned anymore, though, about this being a potential quagmire, about this potentially starting World War III?
I can tell you that of the conversations I had this week, he knew what the risks were, he knew what the situation was, he looked at the history of the situation, and he decided. And I think his decision was right, and I think you can see that from the international community. They all fully support it.
On Thursday, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said there is, quote, no role for Assad in governing Syria. Take a listen.
Assad's role in the future is uncertain, clearly, and with the acts that he has taken, it would seem that there would be no role for him to govern the Syrian people.
So 10 days ago, you said that getting Assad out of Syria would no longer be a priority for the United States. Obviously, since then was the chemical weapons attack. But I'm trying to figure out, is regime change in Syria now the official policy of the United States?
So there's multiple priorities. Getting Assad out is not the only priority. And so what we're trying to do is obviously defeat ISIS. Secondly, we don't see a peaceful Syria with Assad in there. Thirdly, get the Iranian influence out. And then finally, move towards a political solution, because at the end of the day, this is a complicated situation. There are no easy answers, and a political solution is going to happen. But we know that it is not going to be, there's not any sort of option where a political solution is going to happen with Assad at the head of the regime. It just, if you look at his actions, if you look at the situation, it's going to be hard to see a government that's peaceful and stable with Assad.
Well, of course it's hard to, but is the position of the Trump administration that he cannot be ruler of Syria anymore? Regime change is the policy.
Well, the regime change is something that we think is going to happen, because all of the parties are going to see that Assad's not the leader that needs to be taking place for Syria. So what I think you're seeing is this isn't about policy or not. This is about thoughts. And so when you look at the thoughts, there is no political solution that any of us can see with Assad at the lead. And so I don't think that that's something for the United States to decide. That's something the entire international community has decided, that it's going to be hard pressed to see Assad in that leadership role. And so you're going to see the president's going to very much watch this. We are all going to keep calling out the international community and asking them to push for a political solution. We're going to continue to call out bad actors when they do something like this, and you're going to see this administration act when they think it's appropriate.
You've talked about the possibility of further military action. As you know, President Trump used to believe that congressional approval was needed for any kind of military strike in Syria. I know you're a big fan of his tweets. Here's one of his tweets from 2013, quote, "The president must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not." If you're confident that the Assad regime was behind this chemical weapon attack and the possibility of further military action is there, should the Trump administration lay out the evidence, come to Congress, and get the specific authorization to use force?
Well, it depends on the action, but I can tell you that he worked very closely with the leaders in Congress, all of the cabinet members. First you have to give huge kudos to General Mattis and the military for how they handled this so flawlessly. He really worked with, I know General Kelly was on the Hill, the Vice President was on the Hill. I mean, they very much stayed in communication with leaders of Congress. And I think that's what you're going to see this administration do, is the only surprises are going to be to the international community, but we're going to focus on working with everybody. We see this very much as a team. The president has very much acted like this as a team with all of his cabinet members, but also with members of Congress. And so I think that he's going to continue to work with them when it comes to actions like this.
Is it fair to say that the president will keep Congress informed, but there's no plan right now to seek an official authorization for use of military force?
It's fair to say that he has very much said that he wanted to keep Congress informed and a part of what was happening as it was happening. But you'd have to ask him on the congressional thoughts. I haven't had that conversation.
Speaking of Congress, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said on Friday that he would look favorably on stepped-up sanctions against Russia, stepped-up sanctions against Iran, and others who support the Assad regime in Syria. Does President Trump want tougher sanctions on Russia and Iran?
I think it's conversations that we'll be having and have started to have going forward. But I think you have to look at the situation. Here was, you saw this terrible tragedy on innocent people, a lot of them children. And the first reaction from Russia wasn't how horrible. It wasn't how could they do this. It wasn't how did this happen. It was Assad didn't do it. Assad didn't do it. Why was that the reaction? And so all of that is in play. That's why you're seeing the investigation on Russia. That's why you're seeing the fact that we know the evidence on Assad. We've seen it. We know exactly what happened. And so we're calling them out. But I don't think anything's off the table at this point. I think what you're going to see is strong leadership. You're going to continue to see the United States act when we need to act. We're going to have the backs of our allies, but we also need to see our allies have our backs, which very much happened in the United Nations this week, especially led by our British counterparts. And you're going to see us continue to make sure that we're doing everything we can for the safety of the United States people, but also for the safety internationally. We think this was not only a national security issue, this was an international security issue. And I think the president wanted to make that known and make that response well pointed out.
Ambassador Haley, stay right there. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. White House officials say that these are the specific images that President Trump says convinced him to launch an attack against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad after a chemical attack on civilians that killed at least 80 people, including many children. These photographs were invoked by UN Ambassador Nikki Haley in a moving address to the United Nations this week. And we're back with United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley. As you note, the Russians are denying that Assad had anything to do with it. In fact, the spokesman for the Russian Defense Ministry this weekend said that the U.S. has no proof of chemical weapons at the airbase that was attacked by the U.S. military. And he said, quote, "It's all looking a bit too much like Colin Powell's test tube with white powder." Will the Trump administration produce the evidence that you just referred to?
Well, first of all, it cracks me up that Russia can say those things with a straight face. I mean, truly, it is amazing that they continue to cover for Assad. And it's very telling, and it's not putting Russia in a good light at all in the international community. What we've seen is, in our meetings this week, we were told of the evidence. We saw the evidence. The president saw the evidence. All of that's naturally classified, and I'm sure when they can declassify that, they will. But it's very clear what has happened. And you look at Director Pompeo, he's been talking with his counterparts in the international community and sharing the evidence and the information that he has. And I think the international community has pretty much spoken, and Russia's out there on an island saying that Assad didn't do it because everybody else is very clear and knows that Assad did.
Is Congress going to be brought in the loop on this evidence?
You would have to ask the president that. I know that basically the president just wants to be in communications with the Congress on everything that is happening. And so his goal is to make sure that they're always informed of what he's thinking and what he's doing.
You alluded to earlier Russia trying to help Assad cover this up. What do we know for a fact about Russia's possible involvement in the weapons attack? Obviously, they have a military presence all over the country. There are reports that the Pentagon is investigating whether or not Russia may have bombed a hospital to help cover up evidence. What do we know for a fact?
I think we know for a fact that Russia needs to provide some answers, because when you look at the situation, are we going to, Russia's got to tell us which one it is. Either they knew that there were chemical weapons and they knew there was going to be chemical weapons use and they just hid it from the international community, or they're being played for fools by Assad by him having chemical weapons and they're just in the dark and they don't know anything about it. And don't forget that Russia was the one that took the charge and said they were going to make sure there were no chemical weapons and that no chemical weapons would be used. So they now have to answer for this. How can they with a straight face cover for Assad? Because if they're covering for Assad, then what are they really saying? They're saying by covering for Assad that they knew that it was there, or they were incompetent by having chemical weapons there in the first place. There's a lot of answers that need to come from Russia. I think that's why it's good that Secretary Tillerson's going to Russia this next week, and I think that there'll be a lot of answers that come out of that meeting, and I think that's when the president will make his decision.
President Trump made this decision in part because of the images he saw from the chemical weapon attack, the beautiful babies, in his language, that were killed. How do you square that with President Trump also banning refugees coming in from Syria? I understand wanting more intense vetting. I certainly get that. But if we're talking about beautiful babies being slaughtered, why not allow Syrian refugees who are children and maybe their mothers to come in after they've been vetted?
His focus has always been from the very beginning, and I've seen this and witnessed this in multiple occasions. He very much believes in the responsibility of keeping Americans safe. That is That is very strong with him. That's something he wants to do. So when this refugee situation came up, he actually challenged the community and challenged his team and said, prove to me that you can vet properly so that we can keep American people safe. And I think in these areas, they said they couldn't vet properly. They said they didn't have enough information. And I think you've got a president here who's not going to risk American lives and have that threat when it can't properly be vetted. But you also see a president who is compassionate, who is very much not going to put up with violations in chemical weapons use, because he saw that this week very much as not only a national security risk, but also an international security risk.
But certainly you don't think Syrian children pose a risk to the American people.
Well, Syrian children have to come with Syrian adults, and you don't know. It's hard to know based on the vetting process. And that's unfortunate that we can't find that out. But hopefully we'll get to the point that we can. But as you heard, there was a refugee on the news yesterday that basically said, look, he's in the United States, but he's waiting for everything to be worked out in Syria because he wants to go home. He wants to be with his family. I think that's, at the end of the day, we need to remember Syrians don't want to live somewhere else. They want to be home. They want to be with their family. They want to be with their loved ones. And that's the focus of why the airstrike happened this time, which is to try and move that political solution, move any of these careless acts that are just meant to cause horror, not on the people that they claim are ISIS, but on actually the innocent civilians that are in the area. And so I think you're seeing the president handle both of those responsibly, and I think he's keeping Americans safe, and he's also trying to do what he can to protect innocent civilian citizens in Syria.
Ambassador Nikki Haley, we thank you for your time and for taking our questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jake.